Good afternoon. I know we're going to have some more people trickling in because the session downstairs with Terry Foulds is running a little behind, so we'll welcome them when they get here. But for now, let's get going. Welcome and good afternoon. This is our final session of Words, a weekend that has absolutely flown by. I hope you've had a chance to make it to some of the other wonderful readings and discussions with authors as well. My name's Jennifer Hall. I'm a journalist with CBC News, and so words are my life. And so as a lifelong Londoner, I really embrace this festival, as I know we all do too. So let me introduce our two guests today. Adam Foulds is a poet and novelist from the other London, who now calls Toronto home. With 7 novels under his belt, he has received some of the rare honors of being nominated and having won some of the most prestigious prizes out there for fiction. Both of our authors can actually claim that. Adam's latest novel, Dream Sequence, which we'll be chatting about and hearing a segment of today, was longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize this year. And his 2009 novel, The Quickening Maze, was shortlisted for the prestigious Man Booker Prize. Kathy Page is the author of 10 books, who also hails from the UK, as luck would have it, and now calls Salt Spring Island home, where she also teaches at Vancouver Island University. Dear Evelyn, the novel we're discussing today, earned Kathy the 2018 Rogers Writers' Trust Prize for Fiction. 2 of her previous works, Paradise and Elsewhere, and The Two of Us, were nominated for the Giller Prize. So please join me in welcoming our highly accomplished guests today. I should tell you that what we're going to do is talk a bit about the books. We're going to hear some readings chosen by our guests. We'll talk about those. And also, we always want to have a chance to hear from you as well. So perhaps as you're listening today, if you have some questions that come to mind, we're open to your questions and would love to hear them at some point as well. I'll first just give you a little sense of these 2 novels, and then I'll have a seat over here and we'll have a chat. Dream Sequence explores 2 alternate worlds, one belonging to a popular British television actor, Henry, who wants to kick his career up to the next level in film. He wants to be a movie star. The other world we follow in this novel is that of Kristen, a recently divorced American woman who imagines a fantasy relationship with the actor. And her obsession is dark and it's foreboding. So much so that, as a matter of fact, among other honors, I discovered that Dream Sequence made the CBC list for the most creepy novels to read this Halloween. Did you know that? Who needs a booker? Dear Evelyn takes us through the highs and the aching lows of a marriage that lasts 70 years. Harry is a young lover of poetry who, newly married to his dear Evelyn, must leave for the Second World War. Evelyn is a strong and independent woman struggling to find her place in the world. As one reviewer put it, it is a searching and touching depiction of where married lives merge and the places where they never do. Both novels are published by Biblioasis, a Canadian independent bookstore and publisher based just down the highway in Windsor. So let's have a chat. Thank you. Okay. So we can see each other? Okay. Kathy, I was fascinated to discover that the love letters we encounter in this novel, written from this young man as he is away serving in the Second World War, home to his brand new wife, are based very much in reality, your father's own letters to your mother. But it took you, I gather, about a decade to actually turn it into this. At what point did you decide this is a treasure trove I need to mine and turn into this novel?
Oh, yes. Well, I'll tell you a bit of a story about that. Yeah. This book is unusual for me in that it is quite personal in its origins. Most of my novels have been nothing to do with my own life. But this one arose when my parents, we were talking about parents and visiting aging parents, but my parents were, during the time I knew them as the oldest of 3 daughters, so they were always middle-aged to me, fairly argumentative people, quarrelers, we would have dinner table arguments. Sometimes plates would be thrown. Not anything worse than that, but argumentative. As they approached their 90s, however, this became exaggerated and exacerbated, and they quarreled very bitterly most of the time that we could see, and it was quite distressing. There was very little we could do about it. As we soon learned, they didn't want us to interfere. Then, at the same time, my mum, in the way that elderly people often do, started to want to get rid of things in the house and simplify their possessions. And one of the things she wanted to pass on to my oldest sister, who was mentioned in them, was this set of love letters written in 1941 onwards, I think, from my father to her during the Second World War. At this point, we all read them. And it was an amazing experience to read these letters, which were full of interesting historical detail, but the main thing about them was that they were clearly designed to maintain a long-distance relationship, and they were also very passionate and quite well written. So you can see where I'm going with this. You put the two things together, the beginning, the passionate, articulate beginning, and then you end up with what seems like a rather bitter end. And there's a trajectory there, and a painful trajectory. And I suppose as a fiction writer, that I decided that the way for me to explore that was in writing fiction. And I wanted to set up the situation with two similar characters, but not identical, and to explore a couple of questions, one of which was, were the seeds of the end in the beginning? And another was there any point at which this could have been changed if one of them or both of them had taken a different choice or done something differently? And I also was curious as to whether love still lurked there in what the seemingly bitter end. And then, I wanted to do it, but it was actually emotionally and technically very challenging. And one of the things that inhibited me was these letters, which cast a sort of spell because they were so wonderful. Eventually, I asked my father whether I could have his permission to use them in a way that I could not yet specify in a fiction, and it was given to me. And even further along down the line, I got my sister's permission to do the same thing because that too was inhibiting. So in the end, to cut a long story shorter, I ended up using the letters sometimes verbatim, sometimes edited, and sometimes I wrote new ones. So it really did get kind of integrated into this new reality.
I gather there were more than 160 letters you had to choose from, but not very many from your mother to your father because soldiers weren't allowed to carry, of course, couldn't carry a giant stack of letters around with them in the war.
Exactly. I don't know about allowed, but it was not possible. Yeah.
Do you feel that you came to know both of your parents better through this process?
Yes. But really who I came to know better was my characters. It is a sort of subtle distinction when you're writing a novel so closely based on real things, but they're definitely characters in the book. But one thing it forced me to do was to look at all the social history of that period from between the wars, as it was called, until roughly 2010, and to understand how profoundly our social conditions and social permissions, you might call them, what's possible for us socially, sexually, all these things, how profoundly they affect each generation, and how profoundly they affected my characters, and particularly Evelyn. Yeah.
Adam, I know that your novel has many roots in reality as well. You are talking about, we come to know Henry, who I found to be a very likable guy, who is an actor who, as many actors would be, struggles with his own ego and struggles with his striving for success. And you have had friends who have been in that role on the eve of an audition. As I read some of the passages where this man is preparing for an audition, I wondered, I started looking up your biography more intensely and thinking, has this guy been an actor? Because you really captured the angst. And did that come from conversations with your friends? I wonder how deeply did you mine your own reality for this novel?
Quite deeply, I guess. I mean, I have known a lot of actors. I've been close with actors over the years from my kind of university years onwards, and have watched them have different kind of paths through that industry, with some becoming, very successful. You would know their names. Others struggling, as is much more typical for actors. So yeah, I lived very close to all that stuff and felt it, the kind of excruciations of that lifestyle from close quarters. So it's quite cathartic to write that stuff. But I mean, beyond it being kind of known to me personally, one of the reasons beyond that I felt kind of interested in it and kind of compelled to write about it was that it felt like those experiences resonated more and more with kind of all of us, that the way some things that I was interested in kind of getting my teeth into in contemporary society have to do with the ways in which lots of people's lives feel more like actors' lives to some extent, which is to say that actors who audition a lot and have these kind of short-term contracts and uncertain futures experience a kind of existential precariousness, which more and more is kind of shared amongst all of us. We don't really know, we know less and less what our future looks like. We know less and less how we'll survive financially into old age or and the like. And, also in our social media lives, we have got used to, or some of us have got used to seeking approval from strangers in the way that actors do, and having some of our sense of well-being or happiness on a day-to-day basis actually hinge on the reactions of an audience that we don't necessarily know too well personally. I got interested in the actor as a kind of as a figure who was kind of charged and had got there before us with the kind of neuroses of our contemporary moment.
You also, speaking of contemporary moments, you describe Kristen, the woman who believes she's having a relationship with this actor, whom she's only met very briefly, shook his hands in an airport, and then created a fantasy life in her mind, and then ultimately becomes what I guess we would often refer to as a stalker. But she's a sympathetic character, and you have said she has a kind of magical thinking that is almost like a replacement for religion, and something that we do see more now, where people are seeking some kind of deeper meaning beyond traditional religion with yoga and meditation and that kind of thing. What were you trying to achieve with that?
Yeah, again, I mean, she comes somewhat from experiences in my life where I've come across someone, a couple of people who have been in Christine's situation psychologically. I'm uncomfortable with calling her a stalker, although obviously that in some ways that's what she is. But it kind of belies the reality of stalking, generally speaking, which the vast majority of which is male, and it's ex-boyfriends, ex-partners, and it's menacing and atrocious. She's actually very kind of benignly disposed, obviously, towards Henry, and her kind of magical thinking. I think for me it was important to see her as someone in an extreme state, or kind of constantly preoccupied with the kind of thought that we all have now and then, particularly when we fall in love, which is that the kind of thinking of a sense of fate, that something is meant to be, that this person is, I'm destined to be with this person, or any of that kind of. It's getting kind of more and more. You hear about people thinking about their connection with the universe and with the intentions of the universe for them. So she's kind of someone who's kind of, an extreme version of a whole set of thinking that is more and more popular and is, as I say, is also benign there's a kind of yoga, tarot, astrology, spirituality, which feels like it's getting more kind of abundant currently. And her having had this very intense experience, the little section I'll read will kind of describe that, has this really religious conviction that she and Henry are meant to be together, and that it is what the universe wants, and her trajectory through the novel is an attempt to bring that about, to come into conformity with what has been revealed to her as the essential kind of nature of things.
Unlike Kristen, who lives in a reality largely based in her mind, Evelyn is almost, it seems, stuck in a reality, a woman looking for her place in the world at a time when her place had to be in the home. And you sense her growing frustration with perhaps never achieving her own dreams. Can you talk to us a little bit about the frustrations that you saw in Evelyn?
Thank you, yes. Yeah, looking back at the particular time when the romantic part of the story begins, it's just before the war. And at that point, Evelyn it's something I often read, actually, I don't think I will today, but Evelyn is fundamentally quite ambivalent about love and marriage. She has her parents' marriage to model that from, which is a very uneven marriage in which her mother puts up with a great deal from her husband, but is still very much loves him. And to Evelyn's mind, her mother is a bit of a, quote, doormat. And she doesn't want to be that. She wants to be something less at the whim of others' power. She wants to have her own integrity and strength. And one of the interesting things I think about not just Evelyn, but about many characters that I've written about, is that she has a strength of will and a sort of pure energy about her as a character, which is a force which can be both helpful to her and also taken to extremes. It can turn into its opposite and be a kind of weakness or an inhibiting factor. So there she is with that going on, and then she's at a point in history when the moment she accepts, or despite her misgivings, that she accepts a proposal to get married, she will be fired from her job because that's what happens. So she has a lot of adaptation to do as everyone did, during the war years and subsequently when she is, by that time, a mother. So she goes from being a fairly spoilt young woman, albeit working class family, but very much the apple of her mother's eye, to being a single mum, effectively, very quickly. Yeah.
The novel tracks a 70-year marriage, too, as we've alluded to. And I know you have a reading that will give us a sense of the beginning and the end, a couple of readings you'll do.
I can do that,
okay,
yeah.
Please take yourself over to the podium, then, if you will. And we will enjoy. These books are both for sale, of course, up on the table in the lobby here when you leave. And I do encourage you to pick them up. And our authors will be around to sign them for you if you like. But for now, we can get a taste.
So, still audible? Yes, that's great. I thought I'd just illustrate what I've talked about in a way, the trajectory of the novel. And I'll begin with a letter. And this is written in the spring of 1943. The male protagonist here in the marriage, whose name is Harry, is in Tunisia. Dear Evelyn, thank you for letters 65 and 58. I love reading them and knowing what you did many weeks ago. But whatever you write, I have sadness and longing, and always I want to join with you in those wonderful ordinary things. What can I write to you in return? I can't say what we are doing or where we are, except that you can follow it on the newsreels and it is hard and dirty work. It boils down to sand, more sand, even more sand, flies, and shooting. Some places have somewhat less sand, perhaps rock instead of sand, or even some trees and flowers, plus mosquitoes along with flies. But we are never far from sand. If you feel like a parcel, our needs are cigarettes, tobacco, soap. But these are dull enough subjects, which slip from my mind when I think of you. What I should write to you about are the 1,000 memory-torn longings that are the you that lives with me. Always in adversity, or when I feel so little a part of the life around me, and this is often that all men and things are enemies, my mind shuts out the present, and I can spend timeless hours with my head safe pillowed between your arm and breast. I see you do again countless things that you did so long ago. I can feel the still coldness of December nights on the heather when you restrained my hot lover's abandon. So vividly the soft pressure of your breasts, the tautened touch of your thighs, while your lips passed the silent message that was heart's conversation. But the present is even harder afterwards. I love you. Only love's madness could give hope in life's morbid sanity. Forgive me, my love. I'm very tired and half mad. So that, as I said, would be 1943. And fast forward to, let's say, around 2008. And we're near the end, but I hasten to add, there's still a lot to happen. Harry and Evelyn have stayed married through a complicated journey that you would discover if you read the book. Their relationship has become embattled, and they've just recently had a terrible row. And right after this row, Harry has fallen down, ended up in hospital with a dislocated hip and pneumonia, which, as you will know, is not a good scenario. We both have "do not resuscitate" written on our notes, Evelyn told the doctor, whose name she felt she could not pronounce. You knew, of course, that this sort of thing could suddenly happen, but nothing prepared you. It was vital that they understood what you wanted, that you did not want to be a cabbage or to have someone mopping up after you for years on end while you slowly declined. Thank you very much. Or to do that mopping up. You wanted to either live or not. No, the doctor told her. That's different. I didn't mean to worry you unnecessarily. There is a good chance this treatment will be successful. But looking at Harry, she doubted it. His skin papery, his cheeks hollow, his chest barely rising. The transparent plastic over his nose and mouth, the horrible whiffling of the oxygen machine, tubes going into his arm, a bag of brownish yellow liquid. Could he hear her? She asked him several times. No response, nothing at all. Often they can hear even when they can't speak, said the Irish nurse, who came to tell her that Valerie had called the desk and was just setting out. She would be 2 hours then. It is best to talk to him, dear, just in case. Screens divided them from other equally unresponsive patients, none of whom had anyone with them. It reminded her of the terrible time, half a century ago, when she and her mother had sat in her parents' bedroom with her father while he died. Her mother had wanted her to say a nice goodbye to him, yet she could not. She was still furious with him, and the words just would not come, and the smell was awful. And then, years later, with her mother, she didn't get the chance because it just happened so suddenly. You never knew. She had always hated hospitals, but actually it was better here with everything clean and people to help. Can you hear me, Harry? She asked again, speaking slowly and very clearly. This is Evelyn here, your wife. Valerie is on her way. You fell down. I've told them about the DNR. It's been a shock. She swallowed, studied what she could see of the face lying on the pillow. He was like someone from outer space, his skin flaking away, the bristles growing through. How he hated to miss a shave. She drew in a breath, leaned closer. Look, dear, I do want you to know that I know that I've been a very lucky woman. She took a deep breath. Something in her loosened. The words had been heavy, something she had had to make herself push out of her mouth, but now suddenly they were coming easier, as if of their own will. I remember how you propped yourself over me in the bomb shelter to protect me. How strong you were then. How you got the house built, worked the garden, the lovely holidays we went on. How good you always were playing with the girls. And it's just a crying shame how things end up, but, dear, we don't get to choose. He did not so much as move. She leaned closer, her lips only inches from his ear. You treasured me, she said. You were a good husband, devoted, and I never regretted saying no to Alexander Grotowski. Thank you, dear. Did you hear me, Harry? He probably didn't. It was probably all a waste of time. Or perhaps that was a good thing. Yet she asked twice more, did you hear me, Harry? And then she had to go and wash her face in the ladies. There were no paper towels. On the way out, she went left instead of right, got lost, ended up in cardiology, and one of the cleaners there had to lead her back. The Irish nurse brought her a cup of tea and a shortcake biscuit, and then Valerie arrived to take her home. But then, 4 days later, there he was, sitting right up, alert, if noticeably thinner. He had a bit of a wheeze, but no coughing at all. The arguments, the fall, the ambulance, the excruciating pain when they pushed the hip back without anaesthetic because his lungs were so bad, all the things she had said to him when he lay there, apparently on the brink of death. He seemed to remember none of it. Well, I'm sorry to have been so much trouble, he said, smiling at her, as if he had never stood in the living room and accused her of being tyrannical, never pretended not to hear what she said in return. I wonder, he asked, whether the next time you come I could have my glasses and the book I was reading and perhaps a pen and some paper or a notebook. Which book? She asked. But he couldn't remember the title, and when she looked on the bedside table at home, there wasn't one. Maybe she had tidied it away. What no one seemed to understand was that he was not the man she had married, not the man who had written those letters in the war or come back from it and built the house. Lillian had those letters now. The fact was that things ended. She felt suddenly very weak, sat down on the bed, put her head in her hands and sobbed until there was not a sound left in her. Valerie, she said a few days later, standing receiver in hand by the phone in the kitchen and looking out at the ivy on the back wall. Yes, Valerie, the antibiotics are definitely working. He's surprisingly bright, especially compared to the rest of them, all lying there with their mouths open. And yes, he seems very glad to see me, even after all that's gone on. Her voice faltered, then gathered itself together. So I took him his glasses and the treasury of verse and some chocolate. Dr. Abioye seems very pleased. But Valerie, I can't have your father back. I can't. I have cleaned that carpet 3 times and it still smells. I have told them, no, they can't send him home. I told Dr. Abioye they'll have 2 patients on their hands if they do. The nice Irish nurse knows what I mean. You're nearly 90, dear, she told me, as if I didn't know. I told them, I don't want to spend my last months or years on my hands and knees cleaning up impotence, omnipotence, incompetence. You know what I mean. So I need your help to find the right place. And Valerie let out a long breath and then said that yes, she would come over in the morning. They would come up with a plan. She was a good girl, the best of them.
Heart-wrenching. So we will speak more about this couple in a moment, but first now I'd like to invite Adam to take to the podium for a reading. I believe you're going to give us some insight into Kristen. If you could set up for us a little bit the passage you're about to read. Thanks.
Hi, so we're going to join Kristen as she sets off to find Henry. Again, as far as she's concerned, he would be surprised to know that they'd ever met, but it has happened. We've met her at the beginning of the novel, and then we've spent quite a lot of time in Henry's company, going for this big audition, starving himself for this role. Hunger and kind of desire is a very important kind of idea in the novel. And yeah, we followed him around doing that, and then at a film festival in Qatar, and just kind of been in the swirl of his life. And then we join Kristen. You'll hear there's a mention quite soon in of Lionel. Lionel is the stepson from the marriage that she's now divorced out of. So a kind of potentially lost relationship with this little boy. It was time to go. The number of her boarding gate had appeared when the screen refreshed. There it was. Kristen started walking, following the signs. It was easy to do, clear and flowing. She fell in with others walking, a movement of people so patterned that with a little swiftness, a little joy, it would be dancing. An electric vehicle beeped and carried past an infirm person wearing huge glasses and a baseball cap. Kristen hadn't been in an airport for a long time, but many of her dreams were set in airports, in this very one, and part of her lived always here with the miracle happening, or about to happen, or failing to happen, while travellers blurred around her, and she could somehow feel with heightened senses the heavy machinery of flight arched overhead. The miracle had happened in this very airport, and now she was back inside it, back inside the central magic of her life, on her way to see Henry again. She had visited the spot where it had happened earlier, where the watches glittered behind glass. The watches appeared in some of the dreams too. She would hear them, chirruping, intelligent, their bright faces attentive to the moment, eternity come to see. Moving walkways bore her forwards. They bounced underfoot. She held her coffee cup, her backpack on her shoulders. Soon she was at the gate, one of the first there, and she found a good seat facing the desk. She took out her phone and texted Suzanne, her sister. In the airport, all good, waiting to fly, kiss, kiss. Through the enormous window, Kristen could see what must be the plane she would be getting on, tethered to its tunnel. Above, there were golden clouds. Kristen became engrossed in one, the silence of its slow, pouring transformations, stretching and gathering, flaring at the top into wisps that vanished. So much beauty, if you only looked. Around her, the few people in their chairs, dressed in soft leisure wear for the long-haul flight, didn't see. They looked instead at their phones, at books, at the floor. 2 years ago, after Ron had initiated the divorce and they were no longer living together, Kristen had come to this airport to fly down to the islands with Suzanne and Linda. The plan was for the vacation to be defiantly celebratory, drunk and outrageous. Kristen had been the first to arrive. She went to the check-in desk. She opened her bag for her passport and printed booking confirmation and had found Spider-Man. This had all come back to her entirely when she went to the restroom in the airport earlier. Everything that had been broken into unconvincing pieces with strenuous recollection and partial reappearances in dreams had come together again. They still had the same brand of soap in the airport bathroom, a soft serve of scented foam deposited automatically in your palm when you triggered the sensor. When Kristen had smelled it again earlier, she had remembered standing there in tears, cooling her face with water, washing her hands. The ordinary, anonymous chemical pleasantness of the soap's fragrance, mass-produced, made her yearn to be like that, to be as okay as everybody else in the crowds of passengers. It was the sight of Spider-Man that had broken her. When she saw him in her bag, the tensed posture, the painted featureless face and white diamond eyes, she had known immediately that Lionel had put it in there because he wanted her to have it, his precious favourite toy, because he felt sorry for her and worried that she might be lonely. And then, with her eye makeup reapplied, her breath once more slow and regular, looking more or less normal, she had emerged from the restroom and met the actor Henry Banks, and ordinary had been forbidden her forever. Dazed, not quite able to identify the familiar face, she said, "Don't I know you?" Henry smiled at her. He said, "You tell me. Seems like you do." They had a brief conversation standing there in front of the display window of expensive watches, and everything became very clear, overwhelmingly clear. When she met Suzanne and Linda later on, they were worried about her because she was so quiet and strange, flexing the fingers of her right hand and unable to tell them what had happened. There weren't words for it. A pure white circle of truth, a pure heat, now sat in the centre of her heart and flowed out, containing everything, a total sympathy, an end to questions, the nature of love. How could she speak about that? Henry had shaken her hand. For a long time after, it seemed singled out from the rest of her body. She would look at it, move it, as though it could, if it wanted to, share its special knowledge of him and tell her what would happen next. And this was all because little Lionel had put his Spider-Man toy in her bag. This was how you knew it was fate. The smallest thing different in either of their lives up to that instant, and it wouldn't have happened. A traffic light's delay of half a minute, and they would have used the airport independently without ever seeing one another. If Lionel hadn't put Spider-Man in her bag, she wouldn't have cried. She wouldn't have run to the restroom. If she hadn't opened her bag in that way, she wouldn't have seen it. Fate. Seemingly so fragile, but it rules like iron because it is meant to be. The seats around Kristin were full now, all the people bound for London. She heard English voices behind her, a couple talking with the flat tang of one of those accents. Opposite, a young man in square glasses, wearing cargo pants and a mountaineering sweater, was reading the Bible. He had one of those beards trimmed to a line along his jawbone to mark the boundary between fat cheeks and a fat neck. A gate of goatee around his mouth. He turned a page. That was nice to see, a serious, spiritual person. He looked up and she smiled at him. He turned away, pensive, as though she were a question he now had to consider. Maybe she'd scared him. She hadn't meant to. Looking around, Kristin felt affection for all of the people travelling on this adventure together, forming into a group as the sky darkened outside, now an awesome vista of bronze and purple, a resonant and auspicious sky affirming the significance of the journey. The journey had to be made. Kristin had known this for some time. She had long ago accepted that her letters to Henry would go unanswered and that she would have to go to him in person. When Hamlet first appeared in her Google alerts, she knew when it would be. And then, months later, when an alert pinged through a tiny article that said Henry's father had written a play, what a family, and had him boasting that his famous son would be at the premiere just after Hamlet, the invitation couldn't have been more obvious if it had become, "Kristin, come quickly." She cancelled her ticket for Hamlet and at serious expense bought one for the last night from someone else. The first ticket she'd brought from the theatre, waking at 3 a.m. to be online and ready for 4 when the London box office would switch on. So prepared, and yet the frantic inaccuracy of her typing when the moment came, the sense of victory at securing a ticket. Afterwards, she couldn't get back to sleep until after 10 in the morning. 2 tones on the PA system, like a doorbell, then a nasal British woman's voice. Kristin looked at the desk. The woman wore the airline uniform's red neck scarf and had blonde hair that spiraled into a bun high at the back of her head. She called the first category of passengers to board. Skipping forwards a little bit. The plane taxied, turned. Squares of orange light, the setting sun coming in through the windows, flowed over people's faces and slid along the walls. A loose roar, like a big gas flame being lit, then a shuddering went through the seats and plastic fittings. Then the plane punched forwards, rumbling, picking up speed, lifting at the front, floating up from the ground. Small domestic lights could be seen in the countryside below. After a meal eaten while watching a postcard-sized movie with headphones on, most of Kristin's fellow passengers went to sleep, reclining under blankets. The little boy next to her passed out completely, limp as a doll. When the mother went off to the toilet, Kristin retrieved Spider-Man from the boy's thigh. She'd given it to him to play with and put him back in her backpack. Even when the lights were dimmed to a soothing nocturnal blue, even with her eyes closed and the blanket up to her chin, Kristin could not lose consciousness. She drifted in the swirl of her thoughts. The future was so close at hand, its light was breaking through, too bright for sleep. Soon she would be seeing Henry live in the theatre. Soon she would be meeting him again at his father's play. Soon all that had been so long delayed would arrive. She smiled, her eyes still closed, images of smiles in her mind, Henry smiling, she herself smiling. From time to time she thought, I'm falling asleep now, and with that woke up. Maybe she did drop off at one point because an hour or so seemed to go missing. Also, the way an isolated memory returned to her suggested she was unconscious either side. The boy had kicked Kristin and she looked across at him being soothed and rearranged by his mother. He moaned at her with his eyes closed, at the mother who was always there outside his sleep. They were flying east into the sunrise and the coming day, and perhaps that had something to do with her wakefulness. When the stewardesses walked along the aisles, opening all the window blinds, the daylight was shocking and brilliant. As the plane tilted, Kristin could see below a blazing platform of cloud. The plane sank into it slowly, whiteness whipping past the windows. Beneath, the earth was in view with quietened colours, vegetable greens and browns of small fields. Britain, just as everyone said it would be. After rapid miles, London was below them for a long time, and then more fields, and finally the lowered wheels banged onto the runway. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. I have many more questions I'd like to ask, but I want to make sure that anyone who has a question out here gets a chance to ask it. So please raise your hand if you have a question for either of the authors right now about perhaps their process, how they got started, any questions about the novels themselves now that we've had a little bit of an introduction to the characters. Well, one thing I wanted to ask you both about was setting, which is often another character in a novel. You've both been in Canada, Adam, I guess about 3 years, and for you, Kathy, about a decade. Is that right?
No, almost 2 decades, actually.
Almost 2 decades.
Yeah.
Okay, so Canada really must feel like home by now then, for you.
Yes, it does, though I think if you come from somewhere else, there's always a sense of having another home too. So it's not that simple.
Well, I'm asking because I'm curious, and both of these novels happen to be set in England. So Adam, if you could kick us off with the role setting place for you, and is that your natural habitat? If you're going to set, this story could have easily been told in the United States about an American actor, for example, but is that the comfortable place for which you would like to play?
I guess. I mean, it is partly somewhat set in America with Kristin's kind of Pennsylvania background. This story, it is very specific in its locations, in that I made a very definite choice about where Henry lives in London, which is out in the kind of Docklands, new money, new development, riverside area. And that's partly to put him in this kind of world of sort of wealth and kind of slightly high gloss surroundings, and a sense of an environment that is very is now very kind of global. He lives in a space that could be in lots of places. He could live in a very similar environment in Toronto or New York or lots of places. So it's partly this slight, actually, that it's a place that has a slight placelessness that I was interested in. And then there's the visit also to Qatar, to Doha for this film festival, and that I'd been a couple of times for a writing project, and I was very interested in that environment and its a peculiarity. It's kind of this extraordinary wealth, I think per capita the wealthiest place on earth, and this incredible contrast between desert and sort of high-rise luxury, which seems to be its kind of two states, which again had a very, I guess that probably I hadn't even really thought it through that much, but that really resonates with the very split way that Henry experiences kind of success and failure and exaltation and kind of personal doubt and devastation. And there's a key scene of him being out in the desert, and so the locations are important, but somewhat international with a purpose.
Kathy, as with any historical fiction, a lot of research we know must be involved, and you went deep into the heart of British war maps, for example, for your writing. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about what that process was like, because you write about the Desert War in such great detail, and how extenuous was that research for you?
Yes, there was a great deal of research of necessity in this story. Because partly of how much time it went through, and also because there's some ability with the characters. It couldn't really, this book, be set somewhere else. I'm sure there are other wars and other love letters and other people whose marriages take difficult and twisted paths, but my characters were very much who they were, and it's a British story. I went to great lengths. For example, there's a scene in which the two characters meet in Battersea Library. It's in South London. It's a wonderful building, actually. I've studied it in detail. I felt I really wanted to write this book in a very intense and focused way. So each setting and each chapter does a lot of work in the story. And so the detail of it was very important to me. So I spent, I think, about a week and a half in this part of South London, which I knew already, and my family had known already. I studied the library, I studied its archives so I could see what it was like in 1939. I took my friend with me, who's a photographer, and we walked a walk that the characters take, and she took the photographs, and the architecture is such that a lot of it's Victorian and would have been the same then, but looking newer. So I was able to deduce what it would look like with smaller trees and virtually no cars. So I did a lot of very sort of meticulous research in order to envisage the walk. Now, sometimes you might say, well, why bother? Because no one's going to notice if you get a little detail wrong, and that's probably true. But I think a lot of us as writers feel the need to really know the world that we're setting our story in order to actually write the story, and certainly that felt like a necessity for me. You mentioned the Desert War. There was a small sentence in one of my father's letters which told the story that at the end of the war in North Africa, there were pockets of resistance where the war actually continued for a few days. And this is, again, only a sentence in the history books. And there was reference in the letter to that last bit of shooting. So I went to a great deal of trouble to track it down and to find eventually in the British Library the war map for that sector. I was then able to use Google to see what that geography looked like now. If I'd had more time and money, I might have gone there, but I didn't. I did it with Google. So, and then using wartime photography and sort of footage from movies and newsreels, I was able to get a pretty solid idea of exactly what he would have seen when he sat where he sat. So that's the kind of research that at least sometimes goes into writing. I also did a lot of research into things like birth control. And I had some surprises when I did that, because I had assumed that when birth control became more commonly available, it was women who wanted it. No. It turns out, at least according to more than one scholar whose work I read, that it was working class men who were really the ones who were most interested in the contraception, the first early barrier methods. So, yeah, that's not so much location as era. But I did, yes, I did a lot of immersion, as I call it.
It's a wonderful way to time travel reading your novel, that's for sure. I want to go ask you both about poetry, but different questions for each of you, because I know, Adam, you are also a poet. And I'm curious, as a writer, how and when does one or the other move you? There are only so many hours in a day to write. When you were looking at a clean slate and a new project, is it a moment in time and how you're feeling if you decide to pursue something that is more perhaps a book of poetry or a novel? How does that process work for you?
Well, in my case, the book of poetry that I published is one narrative poem set in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising in the 50s. And it took the form of poetry because I wanted to write it in a very kind of stripped down, cinematic way with line breaks. It's very visual. It's very kind of concentrated, and it occasionally feels a little bit like a movie script, I guess. I mean, it's stuff described, it's dialogue. So yeah, but that felt. As I was writing it, like I was discovering that form, like I'd found that particular form for that subject. There's a lot of writing of violence in it, so I wanted to have line breaks, which are very useful for writing violence, because you can get a sense of things flowing on unstoppably. You can bring the line up short. You can put little surprises around the corner of a line break. You have this very tight control of the way a reader's eye moves through the story. And I also knew that describing these very extreme events and very controversial events, controversial for some, I think they're fairly easy to judge, really. I didn't want to editorialize. I didn't want to I didn't want to be there kind of morally offering my opinion about the action that was happening. I wanted the reader to have my main character's experience, which is just to be thrown into this emergency situation and one thing to happen after another, and it to kind of accelerate and get worse and then suddenly end, and then kind of history has happened to you, and you have to sort of make sense of it afterwards for yourself. So I would very happily write in that form again, but it depends on a subject demanding it.
It's fascinating to hear how you want the reader to have a certain experience while they're reading. And Kathy, I want to ask you about poetry, because poetry truly is another character in this novel. And we meet, I'm getting the Harrys and Henrys mixed up, Harry, at a very young age when he's having poetry drilled into him and he has to memorize poems, and some of his classmates can't be bothered, but he's quite taken with poetry. That you make that very clear. And then fast forward to later in the novel, and he's deep in the heart of the war and the aching loneliness and the horror of what he's witnessing, and it seems as though the poems he learned as a child are helping him make sense of the world as an adult. How important was poetry to you to put in this book? Because I gather that, too, was a love of your father's.
Yes, and I think it was something generationally that people had a far larger acquaintance with, people of that generation, and perhaps the subsequent one too. So there's a scene I didn't read, I often do read it, in which you see Harry with this very eccentric teacher in his school, going through a year's worth of poetry instruction, in which the poems are divided up into categories by the teacher: poetry of the soul, poetry of the land, and so on and so forth. Actually, one of my first ideas when I started to try and deal with this material was that I would make each chapter connect or focus on a particular poem that was sort of set out in that first poetry chapter. But I soon realized it was over schematic, and when you try and have an idea about the way you're going to organize your material, you have to be quite sensitive not to be sort of cramming your material into the formal structure. So I actually abandoned that. But what's left is a kind of residue where in his life as it unfolds, Harry does sometimes consciously reach for poetry, or sometimes it ambushes him and he reconnects to it. But the other strand of this is that Harry himself wishes that or initially believes that he will become a poet himself. But this is a sort of character choice that he makes early on in the book without realizing that he's made it, that his life is actually going to be far more practical and less poetic than he imagined it, as many of people's lives are.
The love letters, as you say, your father wrote to your mother, some of them quoted verbatim in the novel, and poetry held a special place at the end of your father's life for you and your father as well, I gather.
Yes. I'm interested that I've told someone that. So, yes, we were separated by the ocean when my father was in his last years, and one thing, as his memory began to fade, one thing that we frequently did was I would read poetry down the telephone. I would read it in person when I was there, but as conversation became less rewarding, the one thing that persisted was poetry, and I became very grateful to these poets. They were mainly the ones that my father had learnt at school, classic 19th century and previous verse. Things that were newer, that he'd read since, were less embedded in him. So, I became incredibly grateful to poets, all of them, and the work that they do in that way of touching the sort of raw and inner parts of us.
Wonderful. Last call for any questions. Go ahead. Question.
I would say that for me, a lot of what the work that goes into writing is subconscious, that I'm not necessarily, certainly in early drafts, I'm certainly not trying to organize things thematically so much. There's a lot of attention at the sentence level later on, but again, not necessarily do I become aware of all that I'm doing. It happens from the back of my head, I think. I'm more conscious about things like rhythm than I am about the many interconnections and elaborations of thematic things, which I sometimes see years later when I'm giving a reading. I suddenly think, wow, I put that in.
I do, I think, try and think about that as I'm working. Often, I mean, as I'm... in the long process of writing a novel, there are moments when I'm asking, what is this about? What is the central thing here that I'm wrestling with? And that will resolve into certain kind of concepts or themes that have been central in the different in my different books. And if you remain kind of plugged into those, then they're a sort of organizational principle. So I think doing that means that you're wanting to see certain things in the world, or when you're in the state of mind of this character's world, then you only see certain things in particular. But you also want to part of the writing of the detail. I think writing kind of detail is a big kind of subject for, particularly in kind of modern literature, then you're also looking for details that kind of make the world real through their sort of randomness. When I teach writing, I like to introduce students to that bit in Roland Barthes' book Camera Lucida, where he has this concept of the studium and the punctum when he's looking at photographs. And the studium is this thing that is the kind of ostensible, the official subject of the photograph. And the punctum, that which kind of punctures, is this other thing that makes it real and compelling to him. So it might be, say, it's a photograph of a group of 19th century farmers, and that's the studium, and they're all in their Sunday best or whatever. But what the punctum in that photograph might be that he notices a bit of mud still spattered on the boots that this guy has forgotten to polish off. And that suddenly, when you see that, is this kind of lightning striking. You see the whole kind of world in which that photograph has come. So yeah, you're looking constantly to have things that are to combine these kind of centripetal and centrifugal forces in what the novel is observing.
Other questions? Well, then, I think they're probably going to have to kick us out soon. So I have one more question for each of you. I'm sure everyone would love to know the answer to, and that is, are you working on something presently that we can look forward to? And if so, what would that be? Kathy?
Well, yes, I am, but I like to keep it to myself while it's growing. Thank you for asking.
Okay, well, we will wait and watch. And Adam, how about you?
Yeah, I've been accumulating some essays, which I hope will be a book before too long. Whether you look forward to that or not, I can't say.
We will.
And I'm researching a new novels, but that's kind of long term, I think.
Well, it's been an honor to have both of you here. Thank you for making the time for us this weekend. I really appreciate your conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you.